Okay, this is joint work with Ron Gilson, who's here, and Darius Halia from the Rutgers Business School. There we go. To start with a little bit of background, I think there's a general belief, probably shared by most, maybe everybody in this room, that there's a connection of some sort between corporate governance structures of firms and their capacity to create value for shareholders. And obviously, we all also know there have been significant empirical efforts to try to confirm that relationship, including work done by people in this room. One of the important approaches being the index studies, where the index author posits a group of characteristics, governance characteristics, which they believe represent good corporate governance, add up a score, and then test that to see whether it has an impact on some measure of corporate value, such as Tobin's Q. And the two best known ones are the Gompers index, the G index, and the one done by Lucian and his co-authors, the E index. And they each find a highly statistically significant relationship between these index scores of and Tobin's Q. So our objective here is to try to tease out a little bit more of why we see this relationship. And that's an important question because these studies have been criticized, including by Michael Klausner, who's here, and Katan and Kahan, who basically say they see no theoretical reason why we should see this relationship. And what we want to do here is suggest to sort of try to begin to see reasons for the relationship and suggest and empirically confirm that signaling plays a role here. And the underlying idea here, I'll dig into it a little deeper, but that good managers choose structures that get higher scores because those structures indicate to the market that they are higher quality managers. Beyond that, we want to kind of make simply the larger point that governance is contextual, because as we'll see, we see that this phenomena seems to be stronger under some circumstances than others. And it suggests that these linkages are between governance structures and performance are more contingent and contextual, and the directions of causation more varied than maybe people typically have thought. So what are the possible explanations for seeing this relationship between good scores and a higher Q? One of them might be, right, that better governance structures lead to better corporate managers, that in essence these features over time filter out bad managers. Another explanation, again kind of going from structure to value, would be that regardless of the quality of the managers, that managers who are operating in a better scored structure would do a better job they have more incentive to do so, or they're better monitored, or they're getting better information, or whatever. The third possibility, the one that we end up trying to test, is that better managers lead to choose better structures. The market sees that choice of the better structure and infers that the managers are better, and that inference leads to a higher Q. That basically a change of structure is a signal of market quality. So this third explanation gives rise to our tested hypothesis. So let me just flesh the hypothesis out a little bit more. You kind of start with this proposition that there's an information asymmetry, that managers know more about their quality than the market does, then that a change in governance structure, which could represent, for example, a change in management's exposure to capital market discipline, is a signal to the market of management quality. And obviously the signaling theory requires that you rule out cheap talk, that somehow the choice of a better rated structure is more costly to poor managers than good ones. All right. And this is what we'll try and take advantage of, to see whether this is at work, we want to look at situations where that asymmetry seems to be larger. And we try and do this across time, compare what we might call normal years to a period where we think the asymmetry was unusually large, the period of 2000 to 2002, the period of the accounting scandals. The paper has considerable qualitative evidence that people were surprised as one shoe after another dropped of companies that were highly respected. People discovered that their accounting, in fact, was fraudulent or defective, and that there was then a drop in trust in terms of the rest, that there was some kind of pooling equilibrium in which people were more suspicious of the companies, wondering whether there were more shoes to drop. And then also, in terms of trying to find variation in asymmetry across firms, whether using evidence that firms with a lot of R&D, that there tends to be more asymmetry of information associated with those. Okay, so what's the empirical strategy? Well, again, what we do is examine the normal periods, in terms of this time difference. The normal periods would be 1992 through 99 and 2003 through 6 versus the scandal period. And then we examine the difference between the two, both using OLS regressions and fixed effects regressions, taking advantage of the fact that the fixed effects regressions only look at firms that change, where we think that the change in structure is the signal. So just basic factors about the regressions. The OLS regression, the structure is the independent variable. Tobin's Q is the dependent variable, and we add 10 Fama French industry controls for the fixed effects. We look at change in governance scores, and then also add change in a variety of other things that have been found to affect Q such as these items here. So summary statistics, I'll skip by that. We first ran these regressions, both OLS and fixed effects, for the full sample period, and like the earlier studies, found a highly significant statistical relationship between scores and Q. Here's the OLS figures. Now come the slides that are key to our findings. We then divided and looked at the 2000 to 2002 period and the normal period. Now, in each of these, for both the G index and the E index, we found statistically significant impact of with fixed effects, using the fixed effects regressions of structure on Q. But importantly, for each of these, we found a highly statistically significant difference in the impact between the scandal years and the normal years, that the impact was much greater during the scandal years. Now, on the other hand, for the OLS results, we found, again, that highly statistically significant impact in both the scandal and the normal period, but the difference between the two was very small, far from being statistically significant. So, just to summarize then what we have found, we found that for the full period, high statistical significance, same for each of the subperiods, that the difference in the fixed effects between the scandal period and the normal period was highly statistically significant, and the difference in the OLS results between the two periods was not close to being statistically significant. Is this of some economic significance? Well, it looks that way. For example, if we took a firm, Gompers et al., kind of lumps the bad firms, as they called it, a dictatorship portfolio, the good firms as a democracy portfolio. If we went from a 14 score to a 9, the lower the score, the better the governance is rated. 14 is kind of the best of bad firms. 9 is the worst of good firms. In the scandal period, that would result for a median firm of 132% increase in Q. In the normal period, only a 38% increase in Q. Similar kinds of results with the E index, scandal 31%, normal only 13%. So what's our interpretation? Well, again, we first, pay attention to the fact that the fixed effects results relate just to firms that change governance structure in a given year. And we see this big difference in the changes impact on Q during the scandal period versus the normal period. Why might that be? One reason could be the market thinks during the scandal period that good management's more important, or that these first two explanations of structure leading to better performance, the filtering or the incentives of information, work more effectively during that period of time, or that a change in structure sends a stronger signal concerning management quality during the scandal period. Well, our OLS results, remember, relate to all the firms in the sample, the substantial majority of which do not change in a given year, where only a small minority do. And the lack of difference between the scandal and the normal period in OLS results suggests that the market is not thinking during the scandal period that the causal effects from structure to performance is more important, working better, or whatever. Seems like the market still thinks that for firms that are continuing with the same structure, that they're making the same inferences about what value will be. And that seems to rule out the first explanation, leaving the signaling explanation. So, the answer, I think, is that the change in governance structure itself conveys information to the market. When information's more valuable, in other words, when there's less good other information, we see a bigger impact from this signal. The change is a signal, according to signal theory, because the better rated corporate governance structure is more costly to bad managers. Now, a few robustness tests. We change the definitions of the normal times to periods, much shorter period before and after. We get the same kind of results. Another robustness test, we look just at the impact of adopting or eliminating a staggered board or poison pill, and the difference between the scandal period and normal period is highly statistically significant between these two periods when we look at these changes. Same thing with poison pill, so it's consistent with our interpretation of the full results of the index score. About firms with and without R&D, well, we have reason to think firms with R&D are more opaque than firms without ROD. When firms change their governance structure, what we found was that firms with significant R&D have a greater change in Tobin's Q during the scandal versus the normal period than the change in Tobin's Q for the non-R&D firms, and that the difference, again, is highly statistically significant, which provides, I think, further support for our signaling hypothesis, this time looking for differences in asymmetry across firms rather than across time. So, summary of the results, I think we find evidence in support of the managerial signaling hypothesis by seeing that we see this larger impact on Tobin's Q when asymmetric information problems with respect to managerial quality are higher, either across firms or across time. Our basic conclusion then is that the signaling theory helps explain the index study results. That, I think, is an important result in and of itself, because it's important to know the mechanisms by which information asymmetries, which are generally not a good thing, can be reduced. Suggests why, as an aside, the sharp asymmetry increases when gatekeepers fail. And then kind of a larger point that corporate governance is more contextual than I think the index studies, which look at average firms over a long period of time, might take account of. We are beginning to try to take account of that and notice then that linkages with performance are more complicated and more contingent than often thought. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me discuss this paper. This is a paper called Illuminating the Corporate Governance Black Hole, Contextualizing the Link to Performance. I thought we should talk about the title first. I think maybe the physics here are wrong. Illumination means you shine a light on something, and then you learn more about it. And you learn more because of the reflection of light. But black holes specifically do not reflect light. And so I don't know if you saw this. It was a big deal recently that they made the astronomers made a kind of picture of a black hole, and it took forever. And you can see on the picture that they're not actually seeing the black hole. The point of the black hole is there's an event horizon. Inside that horizon, the gravity is so high that light cannot escape. So we can never see anything. So specifically illuminating a black hole is a physically unappealing. Anyway, we get the point. So this is work on the important question of what the relationship is between governance and value. I think it started, this may not be the first paper, but early work involved things like looking at the relationship between Q. Remember, Q is the total value, market value of the firm's assets relative to the book value, relating that to some measure of governance. Mork, Schleifer, and Vishny used the percentage of board ownership. And I think there's an upward slope here, although obviously the shape is quite interesting. The composition metric work is about looking at returns. Here's one of the main tables. I guess this is perhaps the main table of their paper, where they say the difference in return over their sample period between the portfolio of well-governed companies, that's democracy, and the portfolio of poorly governed firms, dictatorship, has an alpha of 71, meaning the return is higher. Now, the return and Q are not completely different things. If you think about a change in Q, you're changing this ratio of the market value of claims to book value. This is approximately the return minus the growth of assets. And because there's usually more going on with returns, especially in the short run, you can think that this is basically levels and this is changes, pretty much. Okay, and that means they're connected, because if you have a lot of positive changes, then your level is higher. And in fact, you can see this in composition metric, that they have a lot of results about the Q over time, the Q slope over time, and that's going up. All right, so why is there a positive relationship? Let's recap some of the possibilities. Good corporate governance can reduce risk or raise growth. Once we're talking about Q, there are some things that we're not looking for. So we're not looking for things that make the firm bigger, okay? Just proportionally bigger. There's a lot of economics literature with the span of control stuff, where you say a better manager is someone who can produce the same thing for a bigger set of assets. And that's also how sometimes the people think about asset management, is that the better manager is someone who can manage 10 billion instead of 1 billion. Okay, but so that's not what we're talking about here, because we have some kind of relative value measure. But growth would definitely work. So if well-governed firms grow faster, then their future profits and cash flows are higher, and the market is going to assign a higher valuation relative to current book value. It could also be that high value raises governance. It's some kind of luxury good. So we find a correlation, but the correlation is reflective of the fact that when you're doing well enough, you can invest in charity, sponsorships, and good governance. And then you can have more complicated dynamic theories like Hermelin and Weisbach, where high value entrenches management, and then maybe down the line you get bad performance. So this kind of story is more complicated, because you might have different correlations at different horizons. All right. So this paper says when the market is pessimistic about management quality, that's the governance crisis, then governance changes, or governance in general is a positive signal of value. So basically it matters more if you have a high value on the G index or the E index at particular points in time. And the point in time is the crisis in 2000, 2002 with Enron and WorldCom and so on. Governance becomes more salient, somehow more value relevant. And so at that point, well-governed firms should have relatively high prices. The empirics is to compare Tobin's Q slopes on either the G or the E index. in this period compared to the non-crisis years, which is basically the Gaunt precision metric sample and a few years, 4 years after. And let's recap the findings. So you run a regression where the dependent variable is Tobin's Q, okay? You have an index. Here it's G, here it's E. The results here are essentially the same. Let's look at the G results. So in the scandal period, a high value is associated with a low value. The coefficient is minus 11%. In normal periods, it's minus 2.5%. That difference is statistically significant. And this is using René's preferred method of calculating the t-stat on the difference. Okay, so this looks good. Firm fixed effects in here. Basically, the indexes, both of them predict Q with a bigger coefficient, a bigger magnitude in this period than in other periods. Okay, so a couple of issues with this. Of course, this peak 2000 to 2002 of the impact of G&E is very close in time to the internet bubble burst. And so we want to think a little bit about that. In fact, already the Gaunt precision metric paper has a time variation. Through the 90s, the slope goes up. So these are, they don't have a figure like this in the paper, but they have a table where they show the Q slope year by year. So they run a cross-sectional regression every year, Q on the index, and then they report in a table the year-by-year coefficients. And here's what they look like, and what I added is a trend line. So you see it's going up. So if you like, this is a known fact that through the 90s, the slope is going up. In that sense, maybe the reversal is particularly significant because that's not a finding we know, at least not from Gaunt precision metric. I think it does suggest that as we're looking at the time series, it would be nice to have other sources of variation, think about other times. Maybe there's been other crises that we could use, or at least crises for particular industries that we could use, when we should also see increased significance of governance. In fact, there's a little bit of a reversal already, I think, known. This is on the Words website. Words is Wharton's depository for financial data, and they helpfully provide 1991 to 2000 to crisis, basically, comparison of two portfolios, democratic and dictatorship firms, basically the Gaunt precision metrics firms. And here's the valuation relative to the starting point in, I think, 1991. The blue line here is the dictatorship portfolio. The green line is the democracy. Okay, and what you can see is this may be a small difference, but there's a massive difference that opens up towards the end of the sample. This is the same increase in the slope, the Q slope on the index that Gaunt precision metric found. And interestingly, it collapses back. And in a way, this is what the authors, this fits the author's story because the Enron, WorldCom, governance crisis period is here. And this is when the democracy firms are worth more. And then afterward, this kind of collapses back a little bit. I think you can think, I mean, you can certainly quibble with exactly which firm is where and how do you treat firms that move from one portfolio to another and so on. So I don't think this is necessarily the only way to do it. But I think it's fairly obvious that the relative value kind of opened up a lot in the late 90s and then closed back down a little bit after that. So you might think about other things that are happening at that time, around 1999, 2000, such as M&A. We're worried that there's some governance, that governance is correlated with some price characteristic with time-varying importance, such as M&A. Okay? Maybe the probability of takeover bids is high in some periods and low in other periods. If you're well-governed, maybe you're more likely to accept bids, and then you're more likely to be a target. And this kind of relationship between governance and takeover probabilities is discussed by Kramers and Nair, for example. Okay. So how is this connected to M&A cycles? In recessions, there are no bidders. There's no merger activity. So anything that makes you differentially exposed to mergers is irrelevant in the short run, close to irrelevant in a recession, but maybe important in a boom. And remember, M&A is incredibly cyclical. This is just something I grabbed off the Financial Times a couple of days ago. It goes from 96 to 15. The orange line is number of deals. The blue bars are deal values. It doesn't matter which one you look at. This 99-2000 period is very high. Then M&A volumes collapse. But they come back up in 5, 6, and then they've been high since 14 again. Okay, so suppose this has to do with M&A, takeover vulnerability or exposure or probabilities, then we have a very strong prediction that the coefficient should come back up here and then again here. Okay, so I think that kind of prediction is important here. Okay, yeah, so you might even think that there are cross-industry differences because you have merger waves by industry. So if it involves mergers, then of course industries exposed to merger waves should have different coefficients on the index than non-merger industries. Okay. So I think it's reasonable to try to think about these kinds of tests, and there are a few in the paper, but I think a little more can be done. So we have one striking fact, which is that in valuations, the value you have on the indices is really more important, much more important in this around the millennium period than at other times. But in a way, that's just one observation. We would like to have theories that can make other predictions and we can test them as well. And the authors do a little bit of this, say, cutting up the G index and picking, or E index and picking up particular components. But we would like to kind of swim outside this pool, look for other data and other predictions. So I think, yeah, you might not accusing the authors of doing anything illegitimate here, but at the level of the profession, people who study corporate governance empirically, these indices have been extensively studied. And so even though you have no questions about a particular result, just because there's been a lot of papers in the same kind of data area, you should be more and more skeptical of new results. Or put differently, there's a real high value if you can find predictions from your theory that are outside this more well-known data. Is there anything you can do, collect some new data, look in some other country, and so on? So I'm just trying to think of some things. I think the changes in market valuation are gradual. Changes in governance can be abrupt sometimes, and so the announcement returns could be helpful. I'm not saying year-to-year changes in the G index. I'm saying at the date when you announce that you're changing your governance, at that time, there should be a response. It should be higher in that period when you think governance is more salient. That is looking a little bit in a new data set. Okay. You could use other governance metrics, and I don't mean subsets of this. I mean anything else that you think is relevant from a signaling point of view, or exactly whatever your theory says. Or, of course, other countries. Now, the G index has no meaning in Germany, presumably, so you can't just extend the study to international data, but you would have to look for something else. Say when there's a scandal in some other country, whatever measures of governance are known to work in that country should be more significant around the scandal. And I think that's a plausible theory. I think it would be nice to test it a little harder. Yeah, that was it.
I think we recognize, which I suppose doesn't tend to be recognized, that fixed effects sometimes also, they're time variant factors, and therefore, while we use fixed effects to control for hidden variables that OLS doesn't reveal, there's the potential for the reverse. I'm not sure that the M&A activity going on and off should be that relevant. One of the things we see in this period is that a lot of the governance changes that we see were firms that were adopting poison pills during that period of time. So they were doing that even if M&A activity was low. I mean, obviously, the other things we try to do in terms of the trend factors you're talking about is have the shorter normal period, and also examining this impact on R&D. I didn't mention it in the slides, but we also found, just for the whole sample, a difference between R&D intensive firms and other firms in terms of their the sensitivity of their cues to differences in corporate in index scores. That was not at a statistical. It was not statistically significant, but it was sort of at the 80% level, and then we saw this result within the crisis period of larger impact. One paper that I think is probably worth mentioning is the paper by I'm trying to do this right, Amr Aslani and et al. That shows that social ESG firms, relationship between value and ESG firms, which normally one doesn't see any relationship. I think they were measuring access to credit markets, that during the financial crisis, that suddenly ESG scores did help predict access to financial markets, to credit markets, which again would suggest that there are times where things that don't seem to be such important signals other times can become important at other times. Why don't I take questions? Yeah, Michael? Oh.
Merit, I was called on.
Oh. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah.
I have an empirical and two theoretical questions on your signaling model. So you're talking about differences, but fixed effects is not differences. Fixed effects is related, but it's not the same. So I wonder if that's just a terminological, if you have just used the word fixed effects, but actually ran first differences. Or if you haven't, then I think you should run first differences, because your theory is that the effect should be visible instantaneously. Signaling model will bring out the effect instantaneously, so first difference would be the right way
we're doing average differences, not first differences, is what you're saying?
Yes, that's what you're doing. And so like if the effect shows up 2 or 3 years later, your estimate, if it's fixed effect, still picks it up, whereas first difference would not. And I think in your case it shouldn't, because your theory is that it's a signal, like the market sees it right away. And then on the theory side, so signaling requires a cost, as you said in your talk. But I think you also related this to like Mike's and other people's points that these governance things are really irrelevant. And so if they're really irrelevant, then there's no cost of adopting them. So then it will break down. Related, I was asking myself the question, what exactly does the manager gain from signaling? Now, it's very obvious. If you're at the IPO stage, you want to signal quality because you get more money for the stock you're selling. But if it's midstream, and your firms are midstream, then there's only, I think, 2 ways. If I'm the manager, I know I'm a good guy, I can just be entrenched, stay around for 5 years, and then cash out my stock rewards 5 years later, by which time the information will have come out anyway. So if I want to signal now, it has to be because either I'm planning to raise equity for the firm, in which case I need the stock price to be high now, or I'm not quite sure actually. I think the only way why I would want to raise the stock price now.
Okay, so on the methodological front, I have to admit this isn't my strong suit. Darius seemed to think it didn't matter so much, but it seems to me we should try and check those things. On the theory points, let's start with is there a cost? I guess we try and deal with that in the paper in a couple of different ways. One, by looking at some of the elements in the index and suggesting why we think there is a story as to, and Lucian may want to add to this story, but why there is a story as to a relation, why there would be a relationship. First of all, one of the elements is staggered boards, and Michael certainly, I think, thinks staggered boards are relevant. Michael then goes on to point out, well, if you have a staggered board, some of the other things that are measured, like supermajority clauses or ability to have extraordinary shareholders meetings, which are scored in the index, would be irrelevant. But close to half the firms don't have staggered boards, and they could be relevant in those circumstances. And firms that do have staggered boards, for example, 80% of the cases don't have supermajority clauses. So, you may have one, or you may have the other. I mean, I think Michael's right that one could be more sophisticated in constructing these interactions, but I think there's some kind of a story. As for poison pills, I certainly understand the logic of why everybody has a shadow pill if they don't have it. But there seems to be some empirical evidence that having pills does matter. And I can imagine a situation, for example, where if a firm withdrew a pill, then the fact that it doesn't have a pill would make adopting a pill later, when a crisis happens, if there's a proxy fight or something like that, more costly to a firm. And beyond that, I guess, we think there's a story. There is no story as to why we're getting results. We haven't heard a story as to why we're getting results why we're getting results, I guess. I mean, somebody can beat up on the story as to why we get results, but there's no story as to why we get results if this isn't true. And I guess finally, well, gee, if there's no cost, and we've demonstrated you could improve share price this easily, why didn't everybody do it? Now, to your final point, I teach corporate finance too, and I wonder about those things. On the other hand, I think, in fact, managers do seem to care day to day, week to week, month to month about what their share prices are, and there is signaling theory associated with debt also. So at least we have the respectability in our theory that other people think that managers might do this, even if they're not necessarily going to do an equity issue anytime soon. Yeah.
So Holger's made 80% of my point, but I'll just carry it a little bit further, at least one of my many points. And that is, the variation you're seeing with fixed effects are firms dropping their pill. I mean, adopting pills. You said that at the end.
It's
That's
much
driving
more of
your
that
results.
than the other.
It's overwhelming. There are a very small number of classified boards adopted in those periods, and they're all by very large firms, so that's not doing any work. It's all firms that are adopting pills for whatever reason. So your signal, which I agree is not remotely costly, seems to be firms choosing not to adopt a pill and thereby signaling their good quality, or firms adopting a pill, thereby choosing to signal their bad quality, neither of which is costly. So the signaling story is really, I don't think it's right. I kind of like your title for that reason. But now, one more thing you did say that you at the end in responding to Holger, you said, well, look at these results. I totally agree with you. Look at the results in all of these things that that use the indices, particularly the Gomperz-Ishii metric index, they're implausible, but they're there. So I agree with you, it is worth trying to figure out why on earth they're there, but I don't think you've done it.
Maybe my co-author can, since I've given my best.
He and I have already talked about it.
I've given my best best at this.
Michael and I have been having this conversation for a lengthy period. What the paper does is what we observe are people doing things which are, our claim, are very noisy signals. That is, we observe a pattern in a setting in which, in this case, people adopting a pill in a bad period are choosing to do it then. And Michael's correct by saying that, but also there's no story about why a firm would adopt a pill in this circumstance when it's a bad signal, right? There's no signal jamming because good firms aren't going to adopt a bad signal in a period, as Bo points out, when takeovers are dropping. Oh, this is going to be fun. The other point behind the signal is a signal adds information as long as the noise of the signal is less than the noise in the market. So the price becomes more accurate because it adds information that's not there. Now, our signal, and part of why the point that Meredith made, is the study with respect to bond spreads and the impact of an ESG measure. Compared to ESG measures, the two indices here are terrific, because you can pick basically, and there are enough different ESG signals that you can pretty much anyway. And there are some other studies that, taking a very noisy signal, show the same kind of difference between crisis periods that we show. And there, the explanation can't be, our explanation can't be that our signal is noisy. Our signal is extremely noisy. But the signal-to-noise ratio in these periods, the signal still adds information to it because it's less noisy than the rest of it. Now, having said all of that, this is not a general theory. That is, we observe, as Mike points out, there are literally hundreds of papers that report the same positive general result with respect to these indices. Michael and others, but Mike's been a believer, has pointed out that to people in the field who actually know how these things work in practice, just too many of them don't matter. That's the real opportunity. Right? Because we've got to both put a profession-wide reliance on these numbers, and nobody can tell a particularly good story about why in practice they ought to work. There's an awfully nice opportunity. Our story, which is challengeable both on the theory too, not just Mike's concern about people who do this. It is the claim that we are likely to see, we're likely to get a better understanding of when governance matters if we start looking at things and try to identify circumstances when we think there's going to be where a signal is likely to be. Now, that's not the result is this is one story. This is one instance of the ESG studies or others because they're often governance related. But it's an invitation to ideally, just what Bo was suggesting, which is to find other circumstances where a particular context makes even a noisy signal important. And we'll learn something if we start getting a better sense of when the stuff actually turns out.
Yeah, two things. I mean, I thought that the causal interpretation of Gompers et al. Had been developed at least 10 years ago.
We're not making the returns one. We're not making the returns one. Now, of course, that should be debunked, right? We're making the slope points. Well, we probably don't see very many firms that shift. I guess we don't see firms that have 5 factors change in 2 years, but
Right, but we don't see
5 out of the.
So. Right. So my second point is more that I really don't understand the methodology choice, and it's related to Holger. No, if it's signaling, then the whole effect comes in at the time that you put out the signal if the market is efficient. So the best way to then test your theory would be to go and look at announcements of the changes that you are talking about. And if you do that, the evidence would be completely inconsistent with what you find here, in the sense that you find an effect of, more than 100%, if I understand it correctly, in the troubled period. It means that the abnormal return for a levered firm would be of the order of 150 or 200%, which obviously we never found. No? And so it's the changes in those factors, people have trouble finding evidence using event studies that there is a significant effect. Certainly nobody finds an effect that is 10, 20, 30%. And so it's just not compatible with the way you interpret your evidence as signaling effect. I just don't see it. I think you have to reconcile the huge effect that you have during 2000, 2002 with kind of the event study evidence of changes in those aspects of corporate governance. They have to be, with signaling, they should be essentially the same.
So, do you want to help?
One is just to add my sense what René and what you were saying. There are 2 different theories that one should distinguish. One is signaling, the way you describe it, which has a positive feel, it reduces information asymmetry. The other is the managers are willing to drop takeover defenses when they know that the future is good, and therefore in the future they will not have to be afraid of a takeover. Okay. In both of cases, there is information asymmetry, but in the first one, the market learns something. In the second one, just the researchers later on find that they did something in situations when they had this information asymmetry. Now, because you are focusing on long windows, you're really testing the second theory. The second theory is the one in which I'm willing to drop poison pill because I know that in 2 years I'll be in good shape, okay? And you're not testing, and in that case, maybe you are confirming that theory, but you don't find anything about market learning. You're just finding maybe the market, you're just finding that they're doing something, and the researchers understand it. And the only way to test the positive signaling hypothesis would be to look at the announcement. And by the way, here it's pretty, unlike the classified boards, where there is a long window until the market learns about it gradually. In the poison pill, they announce it at a given day when they do the poison pill, so you could find it. The other 2 things that I should mention is, one, Mike, with his known modesty, didn't mention his paper, but we know from his work with Emiliano Catan that much of the firm fixed effect regressions in this area don't work very well because there are different waves that happen of firms of different size. And once you control for that, in different periods, large firms and small firms move very differently. So for example, if the firms that drove poison pill in the early 2000s are larger or smaller, then Mike's work suggests that maybe all the effect is driven by how large versus small changes in value during this period. And the last thing is you might want to look, Alma, Charlie, and I have a paper at the GFE about learning about corporate governance, and we find actually around 2002
this point in which returns stop being correlated with governance, but Q's continues, but lots of things indeed change, and you want to see how those results relate because they happen around the same time. Like we find, for example, that analysts' surprises about firms with good governance and bad governance change around the time, things like that. But
in some sense, though, right, that's the end of our period, right? So I guess I could see taking our normal period as, before and after rather than before and after, but it seems like that makes a lot of sense that during a period in which there was a lot of uncertainty, we then see a change and analysts' surprises go down. I mean, I think you're saying something consistent with, I have to look at your paper, but I think you're saying something consistent with our results in terms of, at least of the period 2000 to 2002 versus after that. But just so I understand you, Lucian, is your first point, again, the first differences versus average differences?
no, that if you are getting your results, and let's suppose that they are accepted, then what you are confirming is what I call the inside information hypothesis, under which they drop takeover defenses because they have inside information the future will be rosy, rather than persuading the market hypothesis, because that hypothesis should be tested by looking at returns in small windows, that's the René and Holger point, at the announcement of the pill. Because you are looking at 2-3, like Kramer's, you're looking at 2-3 year changes in Q, what you are confirming, if the results are robust, you're confirming the inside information hypothesis. And the second point is, whether the results are robust or not, you need to do the Katan and Klausner methodology of controlling also for the fact that there are large and small firms and that they change in relative value differently in different, for example, I know that the years 2002, 2003, the small firms fell much more than the large firms. So just the fact, if there is any difference between their tendency of large and small firms to adopt poison pills, that might fully drive your results in the same way that Katan and Klausner showed that the difference in the valuation of large and small firms, because there were different incidents of dropping poison pills on large and small firms. So that's another thing that you need to test.
But Vicente is the guy.
He's the guy who knows it.
We should talk to because
he's the authority.
He's done what Holger has done, so maybe we should let him talk because
He can resolve it all.
that's at least a Jeff plus that he's done.
No, I was actually going to make a tangential point, but it's a tradition of ECGI. So I'd like to basically suggest that we don't use topics Q anymore. It's a proxy for performance, but it's an inferior proxy to many other alternatives. The good stuff of Q is in the numerator. The denominator is a restating factor that if it's constant, it can be replaced by a fixed effect and living norms. And if it moves in the wrong way. The firm growth in the denominator is taking your performance. So we should try not to use Q. It was never meant to be a performance measure. And I think it should be phased out from new. I mean, it's useful, but we can use something else and it's much better. So I think if it takes 5 years instead of 10, it would be great, that this thing is phased out. That's my It's been made in virtually every ECGI. So I include the G.
Yeah, I recognize that Q has come under attack, but it is a measure, and it does permit this piece to be comparable with the earlier pieces. So. Okay. All right, thank you.